We're in the year of 2023 and naturally pay attention to the countries around us. And some countries are very concerned regarding the domestic influence. But on the other hand, people are also very concerned and regarding the direction of the country. For example, let's talk about China, a country constitutes of 1.4 billion people. On one hand, some people are very much concerned and regarding the aging population in China today, which could impact the domestic economic projection. And also at the same time, younger generations today are no longer interested in building families, and given the fact the unemployment rate in China today is also alarming. But here's the good news. Let's talk about the foreign relations. Did you know the relationship between China and some countries in Africa today are actually thriving? And again, based on the research and also given the fact that countries today with China and countries in Africa with China today, when we look at this economic relationship, has actually developed rapidly over the last 2 decades. Now, if we put that in the number, that the number flows surged from $75 million in 2003 all the way to $5 billion in 2021 for China to invest in the continent of Africa. How should we understand the number? And what about this Belt and Road Initiative? Some countries, either they are still hesitating to stay or to leave, and some countries have already declared their departure from this project. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, if you're familiar with our show, you should be familiar with our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and also he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Marcus, and welcome back to The Missing Piece, and happy summer to you.
Thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be talking to you and to everyone who watches the show.
Well, Dr. Marcus, again, I want to get started because recently that you wrote amazing article, and should I say it's in extensive research regarding the China and Africa relationship, and it's called The Impact of Chinese Investment in Africa, Neocolonialism or Cooperation. Now, I want to get started with the first question, Dr. Marcus. When we look at some of the countries in Africa today, geopolitically speaking, it's not doing quite well. And quite frankly, this political change actually generating much greater noises. But meanwhile, China made crystal clear has never been interested in meddling with the domestic issues among the nations in Africa, while continue to strengthen the economic ties between China and some of the countries in Africa. Now, help us with better understanding how significant is the move for China today?
I believe that when you look into the long-term perspective, which seems to be always the Chinese approach, right? When it comes to Africa, I think China is looking into the continent as the last frontier of development for the world. Also, its location is good because it's closer to the consumer markets, and it is a continent that has a huge demand for what China produces, particularly for the benefits that can derive from the relationship with China, particularly when it comes to infrastructure building. So I think that when you look into synergies or win-win propositions, like you say in China, I enjoy saying that, I think that the African continent really presents a narrative that is very positive for China. Of course, you have problems in Niger, you have problems in Libya, you have problems in Ethiopia, but all countries in the world face some kind of domestic situations that are complicated. And of course, you know, Africa is not a different continent from the other ones that you see around the world. It also faces the challenges that, you know, countries are going through. But when you take a long-term perspective and you look into the fact that Africa is the continent that will have, you know, a very young population in the near future, and it's still, you know, like an amusement park for China to build infrastructure and all that. And particularly considering that, Africa has a lot to gain from the relationship, which is different from what they had in the past with the Europeans and the Americans. But if you look into that perspective, I think that it is a relationship that will thrive in the future, and it's already thriving. And I think that the more you see that kind of development taking place, I think it's a good thing for the African continent.
Dr. Marcus, again, going back to the publication, that again, that's part of the reason why I want to bring the number into our conversation. This is something that you wrote, and you wrote, and I quote, China has increased its investment in Africa over the last 4 decades. Again, flow surge, again, as we mentioned before, from $75 million in 2003 to $5 billion to 2021. But meanwhile, again, as we mentioned in the intro, China today is no longer just we'll say, the new kids on the block, and also some countries are quite disinterested in building this relationship with China. But meanwhile, China continued to increase the presence among the nations in Africa. Here's a very simple question. Is this the backup plan for China by increasing its presence in Africa? And also, how should we understand the reactions from some of the countries in Africa when they're looking at the partnership with China for the bigger picture?
I think that Africa is not the only place where, you will have an interest in developing a greater relationship. I think Latin America is also a place that has shown great interest in the relationship with China. Of course, you see that as China becomes the most relevant player in the international chessboard, of course, you see that this movement really affects other countries. It affects the United States. It affects the European Union. And it's interesting because in certain regions, like in Africa, you see, the Chinese partnership makes these countries, or the United States and the European Union, secondary players or secondary, friends that is not as relevant as they were in the past. And because of that, you do see that there is somehow a campaign that seeks to repeat or seeks to create a narrative that is negative against China. You see, this is not something new. This has been going on for a little while. If you recall, President Trump with the trade war with China and all the political discourse that has been employed against China, you will see also all the negative narratives that have been developed against China because of COVID and the situation that he had in COVID. So you see that there is, unfortunately, this smear campaign against China. And despite all this, I think China has been, adult enough or strong enough to keep the policies and to keep investing and keep understanding that, there will be here and there some countries that might feel a little different or, might bring some of these negative narratives to justify an action against China. But what you do see is that outside of China, those countries that I mentioned to you, or the European Union countries and the United States, are not as willing to invest in these developing countries as much as China is. And not only that, China sees a synergy that those countries do not have currently with the United States or the European Union. So that's the issue. I think China faces the challenge of a very negative campaign that has been run against China, and a difficult one to overcome. But I think that the steady course of China and a long-term perspective is really what matters in this situation. And in that sense, I think China has had a very stable hand in this, in the approach and in the way it has faced these challenges.
Dr. Marcus, I want to go back to the publication again. Your publication is entitled The Impact of Chinese Investments in Africa, Neo-Colonialism or Cooperation. Now, let's define the word neo-colonialism. Now, again, it says, and I quote, is indirect form of control exerted by powerful countries that use for their benefits cultural, economic, and political power to exploit the labor and resources of colonized countries. Now, Dr. Marcus, why is that important for us to understand this term when we look at this China-Africa relationship? What is the indication or what is the implication behind that?
Well, because the idea behind this is to affirm that what the Chinese are doing in Africa is precisely what the Europeans did in Africa in the past. Right? Colonialism was the approach that Europeans used to exploit the African continent out of its natural resources and all that. So when we use the term neo-colonialism, that means that it is a country that is employing basically the same techniques of the past of exploiting those countries, exploiting the resources, and taking the resources away and leaving these countries really with nothing. Now, this is a narrative that people try to create against China in the relationship with Africa by saying that China is basically a natural resource seeker. It's only looking for its own interests, and it's exploiting the African countries and paying them very little for the resources that they sell. But they're not taking into consideration that one major feature of one of the major features of these investments that China has been making in the African continent is related to infrastructure, which is a little different from the past. Because when and I think China has, you have that saying in China, build a road and get rich.
That's right.
And you know that when you look into process of economic development, infrastructure is the number one factor that you need to have. And so it's a little different from what people could say in the past, because the European countries would exploit the African nations and take the resources and leave very little structure or infrastructure. And also, one of the things that the European countries used to do is to really interfere in the domestic politics of those countries. And really, one of the reasons why you have so much instability in Africa has always been related to the way the continent has, the lines have been drawn, and also the interference of the European countries and even the United States in the continent. I think that in that sense, China hasn't meddled so much into the internal affairs of the countries because it's one of the principles of the Chinese, external relations and foreign relations. So when you look into this, you understand that applying the term neo-colonialism, saying that the Chinese are basically repeating the same things of the past, is certainly, a mistake. That I think it is a mistake that has, a certain agenda behind it. You want to create a fear, and particularly for countries that have been colonized, the idea that, China is coming again and repeating the same things of the past really creates a fear. So by repeating and creating this narrative that, China is a new colonialist in Africa, you try to reproduce the fears of the past. But when you look more intensively into what the Chinese have been doing, you see that two of these basic aspects are out. China is investing in infrastructure, which is it's a good thing for the long term of the country, for the long term development of the country. And also China is not meddling into the domestic politics, which is a sign that, somehow will force these countries to mature on themselves and not be always guided or always, be somehow influenced by what takes place elsewhere.
Dr. Marcus, again, as we mentioned before, I want to bring Belt and Road Initiative into our conversation. We know that under the current leader of China, Belt and Road Initiative, it's a major international project. And throughout the project, that Chinese loans have been used primarily to develop Africa's poor infrastructure. Again, this is something you mentioned in your writing as well. 40% has been utilized for power generation, transmission, and 30% for upgrading outdated transport facility. But meanwhile, Dr. Marcus, we keep on hearing the word debt trap when we look at Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly for some countries in Africa. I want to ask a very simple question. For African countries to join the Belt and Road Initiative, is this actually a debt trap for some of the countries who are economically vulnerable or economically unstable at this moment? Or this is actually a favor or perhaps a friendly gesture for China to make the loans to those countries? What do you say to that?
I'd say this, and this is something that people get repeated time after time. About this idea of debt trap, which is something that wasn't created by China, but it was actually created in the past, right? You see, for many, many years, whenever African countries needed money or they would have to give their natural resources like oil and all that, and become entrapped by the debts that they had with those for the European countries or the United States. Now, here's a little different, because you see that, first of all, China is the only country that is willing and has been capable of investing in African countries in the amount that it has. Nobody has been issuing checks like China has to African countries. And when they do, there are so many conditionalities imposed on the African countries that you're basically meddling with with the local politics when you start, creating all these requests and all these requirements for funding to take place. So I think that is one of the major features here that somehow give you a different perspective on how China has interacted with the African countries. Of course, there are good loans and there are bad loans, and we have, throughout history, had countries that have not been able to pay their debts. And there have been initiatives within the International Monetary Fund for countries when they're not capable of paying their debts. And I think that the Chinese will certainly address this issue should it become a problem in the future. Now, they bring the issue of that trap, and they always quote the same situation, like Bangladesh and what happened in Bangladesh, or not Bangladesh, but Sri Lanka. That's one of the cases that people like to mention, without taking into consideration that we had a pandemic and the situation affected the economics of the country. It was not the Chinese loans that were the problem. And there is one difference here too, Will, that we should emphasize, is that I can only create a debt trap if I am doing something that, first of all, you did not ask for, so it's an imposition. And second, something that is not going to generate revenues for you to pay. So here, there is something that we should understand. China is not creating infrastructure that the African countries do not want. The countries are the ones that present the projects that they need for their own development. So that's their own decision. And that's the number one factor. And number two is, since most of the Chinese interest is related to infrastructure, here is an important thing to emphasize. Infrastructure is something that, if well done, if well applied, will generate revenues in the future, right? Build a road and get rich. You cannot do anything without infrastructure. If you want to export agricultural products from Africa, there aren't roads or railroads or ports for you to do so. And here is China investing in these major projects that will allow these countries necessarily to be able to to make money on their own. So I think that when people try to say and use the narrative of that trap, they're basically trying to misconstrue an image of China lending when nobody else is willing to do so, particularly at this time and in this situation. And it tries to create again, this manipulative idea that China is taking advantage of the African continent. The issue is this. At the end of the day, if the countries in Africa that are receiving Chinese money start hearing or start heeding to these ideas, what is the replacement? Will the United States or the European Union step in to, invest as much money as the Chinese are doing? And the answer is clearly it's not going to happen. So that is why I think that, African countries, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the paper, is that I think African nations really need to go beyond page 2 and understand why this narrative is being used and what are the alternatives, if there are any. And the impression I have, based on what I have seen, is that really there isn't a number 2 in this story or somebody else willing to make the kind of investments that China is doing.
Professor Marcus, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you a last question. Again, when we talk about the charm of Belt and Road Initiative, and surely there's no doubt among the countries in Africa, but meanwhile, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative has already lost charm with some countries in Europe. For example, recently, the nation of Italy, and decided by the current prime minister that to depart this relationship from the Belt and Road Initiative, given the fact the current prime minister has gone even further, restricting a Chinese firm's influence on Italian tire maker. So in other words, by disconnecting with Belt and Road Initiative, this is what the Italian government decided to do, and also labeling this Belt and Road Initiative as what I quote, what I find out, quote, improvised and atrocious act. Now, Dr. Marcus, you're the international relationship expert. Help us with better understanding. How should we understand the move made by Italian government under the current prime minister? And also, how much do you think it could actually hurt Belt and Road Initiative, especially for some of the countries in Europe? What do you say to that?
I think it is a movement by the Italian government that has changed and has shifted to a more extreme position in the right. And the fact that China is run, you have the Communist Party of China. That word communist in the West still creates a lot of panic because people associate with, an extreme left. And it's an interesting thing because if you see, and I always say this, if you see the agenda of the political left in the West and what you have in China, there couldn't be something, they're worlds apart, right? There's no relationship between one and the other in that sense. But, in the West, this idea, if you're on the extreme right, and you see a polarization in the political discourse, not only, in Europe, but you see that in the United States, right? This political polarization that has created this idea, and everything that is associated with this movement of polarization somehow is used by the politicians to create this idea that, we're doing something to go away from, communists and, from the extreme left. So I think it has a whole lot to do, a whole lot to do more with the political moment of Italy and with the ascension of the right than it has to do with the relationship with China. First of all, because China is the number one partner, as far as I recall, of the European Union. And And of course, Italy has suffered the consequences of the war in Ukraine, the loss of the Russian market, and but I think that these political movements never take into consideration the high dependence that these countries have on the Chinese buyer and the Chinese consumer. Italy is known for its luxury brands that they try to sell all over the world, and there are no better consumers than the Chinese when it comes to that. So I think that political movements do not necessarily reflect the domestic realities of the economic agenda. And this mismatch between the economics, and the politics is something that countries pay in the long run, and they pay for the mistakes they make. Now, Belt and Road Initiative is an interesting process of China investing in the world, presenting a new face to the world. And I think that the more economic development that we see through infrastructure and all that, and, I must say that even though Europe is advanced in many ways, its infrastructure is already lacking when it comes to, assuring that the Europeans remain competitive. But you see that, they need to rethink. But it's very hard also for you to see this great power competition taking place and somehow position yourself on the Chinese side, particularly if you have American bases in your territory. Or if you have, the military dependency on the United States. So, China needs to understand that. Yeah, and what we see here, and this war in Ukraine has reminded us, is that the European countries, when it comes to self-defense, they really have to rely on the United States. So whatever the narrative that the United States also pursues is the one that the Europeans are going to say that they have their independence and all that. But at the end of the day, if you are basically paying for somebody else to protect you, you kind of remain a hostage to that idea and to that sense. So I think that's when you see these movements by the Italian, you do not need to consider Belt and Road a failure, but you need to understand that it is a political movement that you see in Europe that is a major concern in that sense. But it's just a political movement. Wait for the next government, and Italy has not been a very stable reality when it comes to governance over the last, as far as I know. So we need to wait for the next political wave in Italy and see whether this remains an Italian policy or is this the politics of the party that is ruling the country on the day.
Well, that's right. Again, despite all the negativity, but meanwhile, it's still important for us to understand this meaningful and healthful relationship among the countries in Africa, and also importantly, is Chinese investment in Africa is not going anywhere. Again, Chinese investment will continue to generate much greater noises in the land of Africa. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Marcus de Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at Policy Center for the New South, and also he's focusing on international law and international relations. Also, he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to connect with Dr. Marcus and check out his latest publication, which is entitled The Impact of Chinese Investments in Africa, Neocolonialism or Cooperation. Well, Dr. Marcus, thank you so much for your time. It's always been a pleasure speaking to you, and we'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to follow and also pay attention to those international relationships. So thank you so much for doing this.